What's up? Welcome back to my channel. So today we are talking about my reading stats and my favorite books that I read last year in 2022. Throughout the year, I kept up with book reviews, both on Goodreads and the Storygraph, because I actually really enjoy the Storygraph stats. So I'm going to go through just both of those, and we're gonna look and see what type of stats and how my reading went throughout the year. And then I'm also going to tell you about my 5-star reads for the year. I decided that I am not going to talk about my worst books of this year. I do have a fair amount of 1 stars, but I'm actually going to film a video exclusively for Patreon and my patrons because they definitely understand how I am. I just didn't want to receive a lot of hate here on YouTube because of the fact that I do rate books 1 star. So if you want to know all of that tea, you either need to look at my Goodreads yourself or you need to become a patron. Otherwise, these are just going to be all positive things, all my favorite books, instead of focusing on the negative. Okay, so first up, I read 104 books in the year of 2022. I actually completed my goal. I only had my goal at 80 books and I went above that, so I am really proud of myself for that. It looks like that was 34,480 pages read. According to Goodreads, the shortest book was Things Have Gotten Worse Since We Last Spoke at 120 pages, and the longest book was House Rules by Jodi Picoult at 532 pages. The most popular book that I read this year was It Ends With Us by Colleen Hoover, and it actually was a reread. I think it's the only book that I reread. And then the least popular book that I read was The Underwear in My Shoe, and this one I can definitely see why it's the least popular because it's a memoir about this lady that went through IVF. And so I loved it. I thought it was absolutely amazing, but I can see how it doesn't pertain to a large audience. Now, my average rating for this year, it actually is pretty low. I always have a very low average rating because of the fact that I rate books. In my opinion, very honestly, I'm not afraid of giving 1 and 2 stars if that's how I feel like a book is. So my average rating was a 3.0. That's probably one of the lowest ones that you've seen. I feel like everyone else has really high ratings, but that's me, you guys. According to the Storygraph, my top genres for this year, thriller was at around 43 books, mystery was at 25 books, contemporary was at 17 books, memoirs was at 17 books, and romance was at like 12 books. I have no clue if that adds up to 104. I'm just like reading from a graph, so those are like average numbers. The Storygraph also gave me my top authors that I've read this year, and it said I read 7 Jodi Picoult books, and I read 4 Kirsten Mauchline and 4 Colleen Hoover, which is actually surprising. I didn't realize I read that many Colleen Hoovers this year because I think I finished like all of her books now. I think I've read all of them. Also from the Storygraph, my top mood was dark. We're not shocked, okay? It also says that I read 72% fiction and 28% nonfiction. Okay, so let's go ahead and talk about my favorite books that I read this year. I'm going to do 5 stars, and I'm probably gonna talk about any 4.5s that I might have had. I don't think I'm going to delve into the 4s because it's gonna be kind of like my top favorite books. I don't think these are in any type of order, so it's not like the actual order that I read them in, but we're gonna start out with Cherry Bomb. This is actually a surprising one for me because I normally don't love the more like smutty romance, but it definitely had enough like emotion to it, and it reminded me of Birthday Girl by Penelope Douglas. So I actually really enjoyed this and I gave it 5 stars. I think I might go ahead and read my reviews from some of these books just because when I read them so long ago, I think this one I read in February of last year, I don't want to miss any points that I might have wanted to talk about. So the review for this one was, yes, 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 another taboo/age gap romance that was done exceptionally well. I received this book in a surprise box from Hello Lovely, and I'm so glad. I would have never heard about this book otherwise. I absolutely loved Cherry as a character, but especially the older love interest, Cash. If you're a fan of Jordan and Pike from Birthday Girl, but you want a bit more emotion like a Colleen Hoover book, then you have to read this book. I loved everything about it and appreciated the hard-hitting topics, not just constant sex scenes, although it does get pretty kinky. That actually, man, I should read my reviews like more often because that was way easier than me trying to remember all that. Okay, next up, my 5-star was It Ends With Us. I actually had read this book like 5 or 6 years ago, and once the sequel, It Starts With Us, came out, I wanted to reread It Ends With Us because I remembered nothing about it. And that was actually before I wrote reviews. So I couldn't even go back to a review and kind of like figure out why I liked it. So I ended up rereading it a few months ago and I still rated it 5 stars. So I rated it 5 stars the first time I read it and 5 stars again when I read it. So I call that a win. All right, this one I said, this is the second time I've read this book and I'm happy to say it is still a 5-star. This was my first Colleen Hoover book I read about 5 years ago and I'd never written a review, so I had no clue why I even liked it. I decided to reread it in order to get ready for the sequel and I was so surprised. I remembered absolutely nothing about the book. It was like I read it for the first time all over again. I love the hard-hitting topics, I love the author's note, I love seeing realistic stories in romance books, and not everyone getting happy endings. I even teared up a bit during the hospital scene when Lily asks Ryle, "What would you tell your daughter to do?" when she says, "Daddy, my boyfriend hit me." I think because I'm pregnant with a girl, this really hits home. If you're not familiar with this book, it is about domestic abuse. Just make sure that you read any type of triggers before you would go into it, but I really, really love it. Okay, my next 5-star read is actually kind of more like a food and nutrition type book, but it's specifically involving pregnancy. I won't touch base on it very long because I know probably a bunch of you don't really care about it, but let's go ahead and read my review. I absolutely love this book. Oh, I'm not pregnant yet, but since I'm starting my IVF journey next month, I thought I would get a head start in nourishing my body. I must have read this in the spring, so it's actually kind of cool to see myself pregnant now. This book is for those who follow a Weston A. Price eating style with traditional foods. She does a more lower carb perspective than most, but I still wouldn't call this book keto or low carb in any sort. However, if you are against eating animals, raw milk, or fermenting grains, then this book is probably not for you. I totally agree with the eating style, and I can't wait to adapt it into my life. I also love the chapters about the 4th trimester, how to rest for a long time, take it easy, etc. A lot of this isn't talked about and women are rushed to get back to their normal routines. It really shows us how in other countries and cultures, a woman will rest for a good month or so while her mom and others cook and clean. I highly recommend this book to anyone that wants to have a holistic but traditional pregnancy. All right, my next book is Keep Sweet, which also shocked me that I gave it 5 stars because it is a young adult book, but this one is about polygamy. I absolutely loved this book. I usually read cult memoirs that are true, but this was the first fiction book I read that was based off of the FLDS cult. Some of this story was taken from the nonfiction book Stolen Innocence, which I haven't read yet, but I definitely want to. I think that's why I loved it so much, because it was so real. This was a super fast read, so entertaining, but also sad to see that young girls are treated this way in the FLDS cult. It is a pretty short book, so if you wanted to kind of dabble into the polygamy cult books, that would be a good one to start with. Now we're gonna talk about Spilled Milk, which was actually the first book that I read in 2022. I gave it 5 stars. I really loved it. It is nonfiction. It is a true story. This was my first read for 2022 and I'm so happy to start out the year with a bang. I absolutely loved this book, not because it's an easy topic to read about, but because it's such an important topic to read about. This is a nonfiction memoir, just some names and places were changed, about Brooke/Kelly, who was sexually abused by her father her whole life until she put him in prison when she was a teenager. This is such a heartbreaking and disgusting story to read. So many trigger warnings. This might be hard for some to read who have suffered something similar, and Kelly doesn't tread lightly. I've heard some people complain about the writing style or errors, but I had absolutely no problem with the writing style, and I almost devoured this book in a day. That's how thrilling it was. If you watch Kelly on TikTok, she explains why she's self-published and why there are writing errors, so please don't judge this book just because of that. This book just makes me so shocked and disheartened with all the nasty people there are in this world, and I hope more people can read this book so they can see the signs of child/sexual abuse. Okay, one of the other books I read was The Black Friend on Being a Better White Person. This is also a nonfiction book where you're supposed to be learning something. This book should be in everyone's library. This is a book that every white person should read. Friedrich educates us on racism, inequality, and tells us about his own past. This almost felt part memoir because of his childhood stories, and I really loved that part. I also appreciated that he speckled this book with his humor, so it wasn't just a bunch of information. conversation, but instead felt like a friend was conversating with you. The encyclopedia in the back with the terms was also super helpful, and I learned a bunch of history I didn't know. All right, again, another nonfiction. This one is true crime. As you can see, I've just been loving the true crime this year. This is The Family Next Door. This was written by John Glatt. I said, I was not prepared for how amazing yet disturbing this book was. I'm a new lover of true crime, and this book just makes me want to jump straight into more reads from this genre. This book was so fascinating and shocking to read, and I didn't know about this case prior to this book. This is about the 13 Turpin children who were extremely abused their whole lives, even into adulthood, by their parents. They were beaten, starved, and even chained up for months at a time. I was even more shocked when I found out they were only just rescued in 2018. I really enjoyed the photos that were included in the book as well, but I now want to watch the documentary so I can see footage from the rescue. I think I actually watched some news footage from it, but I don't think I actually, I think there might be a documentary that I didn't get to watch yet because I couldn't find it where it was available. Next up is The Underwear in My Shoe. This is, again, like a memoir, and this is the one that talks about IVF. I said, we love infertility rep. I picked up this book after seeing it recommended in an IVF Facebook group I'm in. I'm currently halfway through my first IVF cycle, so this was the perfect time for me to read this book. I absolutely loved it and thought it was a fantastic mixture of me laughing and crying. Brett is really funny at writing about the experience, and I could relate to so much. She also was super real about her IVF experience, and I definitely was tearing up at her failed egg retrievals. I highly recommend this book to anyone going through IVF or struggling with infertility. I feel like only those could actually relate to what Brett is talking about. And I also appreciate that this isn't some self-help, you need to be patient and count your blessings infertility book. Infertility sucks, and it's okay if we are sad. It's so crazy rereading my old reviews because I wasn't pregnant at that time. It's so crazy. All right, the next one is Perfect Match by Jodi Picoult. As you know, I read a bunch of Jodi Picoult, so there's actually gonna be a couple on this list, on my favorites list. I absolutely loved this book. I will say this could be incredibly hard for people to read if they have children because of the whole story being about a 5-year-old who was sexually assaulted. Jodi is so good at writing twists and thrills, even though her books aren't even thrillers. I was hanging my mouth open at some of the big twists in this book. This is an incredibly emotional read and is pretty disturbing with the graphic scenes of child sexual assault. It is a really important topic to read about though. I highly recommend. The next Jodi Picoult book is A Spark of Light. I actually read this at the beach. I absolutely loved this book. I had so many goosebumps while reading this book. The way that Jodi writes her twists are so incredibly good, and it always surprises me because I'm so immersed into the story and her characters, and I'm not even thinking of how she's going to surprise me. This book especially had an amazing author's note at the end where she explained her research, how she interviewed hundreds of pro-choice and pro-life women in order to create characters from all sides, viewpoints, experiences. This book is about a shooting and abduction that happens at a women's health center that focuses on abortion. I didn't find that Jodi was pushing an agenda, but instead used her characters to tell the stories of all kinds of women who may or may not have chosen to get an abortion. This is definitely a heavy read and could be very triggering for many. There are graphic explanations of how abortions are done at multiple different weeks of gestation. We follow a handful of different perspectives ranging in all ages and races, and it really makes you think about what you would do if you were in those women's shoes. This was also one of the shorter Jodi books and didn't have a big courtroom trial like her others, in case you don't like that. I actually wouldn't have minded seeing more of the trial with Beth, but I was pretty happy with the way the book was written. Oh man, so much nonfiction here. Okay, so we have Hope, a memoir of survival in Cleveland. Gosh, this one was just so good. I just remember, oh man, the goosebumps with this one. This is definitely one of my favorite books of the year. I knew nothing about these kidnapped girls and picked this up on a recommendation from a patron. I am so glad I read it. The audiobook is great too because this was such an amazing read. I went through so many emotions while reading this book because I cannot imagine what it would have been like to be one of these girls. This book is the true story of 3 teen girls who were kidnapped and held prisoner in this guy's basement in a neighborhood for over 10 years. They were raped multiple times a day and lived in terrible conditions, one even birthing his baby. This story is so heartbreaking and really puts things into perspective. All right, another Jodi Picoult. We've got 19 Minutes. Jodi absolutely knocked this book out of the park. I loved reading this book in order to get perspectives of what it's like to worry about a school shooting, because I was homeschooled my whole life. This book gave me goosebumps while reading and listening and was super emotional. I loved reading about all the characters and the twists were even shocking for me. Okay, we got Hunger, a memoir. This is by Roxane Gay. I love this memoir. I almost unhauled this book, but my friend Gwen convinced me to keep it, and I'm so glad she did. I listened to this all on audio and it's narrated by the author, which I loved. Roxane tells us about the trauma in her life from the very beginning, her being raped by multiple boys at the age of 12, and how this has impacted the rest of her life. Her story gave me goosebumps and made me feel so many emotions. It's so unfair that so many people have to deal with such trauma and abuse. Roxane talks about her weight and her body image, and I learned so much about being a plus-size person and how representation is so messed up. Even though I'm not the size of Roxane, I still felt like I could relate to some of what she said about her body. If you love memoirs, I highly suggest you read this book. If you're interested in reading about plus-size rep, I also think this is an important read. All right, one of the books that I rated 4.5 stars was my last book that I read for the year, False Witness by Karin Slaughter. I really enjoyed this, and I think that if you liked Pretty Girls by Karin Slaughter, that you would enjoy this one because I felt it might not have been as dark and disturbing, but it was definitely pretty close to it from what I remember. The first chapter like totally throws you in, and I was like immersed from the first chapter because the first chapter is like super dark and disturbing. This definitely has topics of like grooming, child sexual assault, rape, oh my gosh, like just so many different things. Like there's so many different layers of this book, but the reason that I didn't give it 5 stars is because it was a little long, and at times I was kind of like, it was just a little boring and slow. So I wish it would have been cut down maybe a little bit and I could have rated it like 5 stars, but I definitely got like goosebumps and chills at certain parts, and the ending was pretty sad, so I really liked it. All right, those were all my favorite books for the year. I hope you enjoyed seeing them, and definitely let me know in a comment if you are going to pick up some of these 5-star reads that I had. I know they're not for everyone because they are really like dark and a lot of them had like those triggering topics, but I would love to know if you picked any up that I've recommended before and that you love them. That's it for this video. I hope you guys enjoyed it, and I will see you all in another video soon. Bye everyone.